fantastic to have Fikret Berkes back in town again. We've been working for 20 years.
Feels like it.
And in my mind, Fikret is one of the few who really can combine what's going on the ground with new thinking. It's fantastic that you're taking your time to give this talk and be here for a couple of days and also give this PhD course. So most welcome, Fikret, and we're looking very much forward to these couple of days.
Thanks. Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Thomas. Great to be here. I was here at the Resilience Conference, so I've been at the building, but I'm more used to the Bayer and the university. So this morning I had to navigate my way here. I took a couple of wrong turns actually getting here, but here I am, and it's very nice to be here. This is the first time I've seen snow in Stockholm. I don't usually come in the winter, but I know it's usually more like flowers beginning to come out in March. So, but I was at a workshop in Abisko before coming here, so I'm coming from the Swedish Arctic, which isn't much colder than here, but much snowier. I'm going to talk about social-ecological systems and conservation. The idea of social-ecological systems really was developed with Carl and colleagues here. Other people have used the general concept, but the explicit recognition that people and environment go together, that you cannot separate pure ecological systems from pure social systems, I think is an idea that we have developed and which has taken on quite well internationally. I'm going to talk a bit about conservation. I'm going to give you some examples from our recent work as well. There are really two sources of inspiration for this talk. One is a chapter that's coming out in a book that's about to appear, co-edited by Carl and by Terry Chapin and Gary Kofinas at University of Alaska. This is a chapter that looks at people and nature together in conservation, but it's not a summary of that. In part, it's inspired by the workshop we had in Abisko, which was about biodiversity conservation in the Arctic, which you can imagine is a somewhat hot topic because a lot of changes are occurring more in the Arctic than other places of the world in terms of climate change. So in Canada, I hold a chair called Community-Based Resource Management, and we have been doing a great deal of work recently, last 5-6 years, on community-based conservation. This is the idea that conserving biodiversity really depends on first understanding human systems, institutions, values people have, ethics, stewardship systems, and you can't really do conservation without doing that. So the idea is that to do conservation effectively, you really have to deal with people. Here we invoke an image by Dali as a way of sort of capturing this idea of people and an overlay of nature. This is a 1950 painting by Dali. Of course, many of us are urban people. I live in a city. I live in part of a city called Osborne Village, but it's not a village. It's a very much an urban neighborhood in an urban area, somewhat smaller than Stockholm. But still, a lot of people in the world, about half of the world's population, are still rural dwellers. They use resources in the rural area. And in particular, I have an interest in indigenous peoples and affairs of indigenous peoples. They inhabit a good part of the earth, which is in fact quite a bit larger than the formal designated protected areas on the earth. So I'm asking the question, we're spending a lot of time and effort on protected areas, but in fact, much of the biodiversity in the world is in areas which are not covered by protected areas. It's covered in areas where people live and use local resources. And the part inhabited by indigenous people alone is much, much greater, actually, than all these protected areas we spend our time discussing. Interestingly, in the Abisko meeting, we were talking about protection without protected areas, protection without government formal institutions. We're really beginning to break out of that protected area and conservation mindset. If you look at protected areas, they really sort of three kinds of conservation. This is, I'm not making a big classification of protected areas here. I'm not trying to reinvent IUCN categories, but basically you see that there are protected areas that exclude human use. This is the famous Yellowstone model. And then you see protected areas such as biosphere reserves where certain kinds of human use in certain parts of the area are permitted. And then you see conservation in areas where people do use resources, but there are strategies that connect livelihood making and biodiversity conservation. These are the kinds of projects that we've been working with at University of Manitoba over the past 5-6 years. And this is an international set of projects. Later on with the PhD group on Wednesday, we're going to pursue this in somewhat more detail, and I'll have more on this. But this third model, this third bullet, is about producing incentives for people to conserve the resources they use. And that's not easy to do. And there's a huge amount of debate along these lines, on these points. There are a few trends one identifies in all this debate going on biodiversity conservation, protected areas, role of people, and so on. First, as of course many of you know, the idea of people-free protected areas is under a great deal of criticism. It used to be common practice to exclude all human use when you establish a national park. In Africa, in Canada, in the US, that's no longer considered cool. So new national parks, in fact, are established. There are exceptions, but they are established without removing people altogether, but of course making major changes in their activities. There are a number of items that are in the background of this. Certainly CBD, the conservation of Convention on the Conservation of Biodiversity is one of these international provisions. But on the other hand, if you look at community-based conservation, you don't find very good results coming out. You get mixed results, some working, many not working. And I started in that area. I published a paper in 2004 in Conservation Biology, which was based on a keynote I gave in to Society for Conservation Biology. And so among pure conservationists, this is not a popular topic. And it's the whole idea of community-based conservation is met with a great deal of discomfort. The area that we've been working on, this trend, if you like, is that if you have participatory approaches that create local incentives for biodiversity conservation, that often is a way to go. The examples we've been using, the one I'm going to expand further in the PhD lectures, is the UNDP Equator Initiative, United Nations Development Program, Equator Initiative. There are, of course, many other trends here. And one of them is an interesting one that combines some of our work with social-ecological systems and some of the work that's been done in commons theory development with Eleanor Ostrom and others. And that's the idea that if you look at some of the broader trends in large conservation areas in the world, you see that there's a great deal of effort to develop unifying principles, big conservation principles. So there's a great deal of work that goes on in characterizing biophysical systems, developing theories about biophysical systems, connectivity corridors, etc. And the large international NGOs that work in the conservation area have been pushing these. And of course, who doesn't want unifying principles? We all want unifying principles. The problem is, when you develop these unifying principles, you create monolithic models, large models that you assume are applicable everywhere. And you use these models, to use the words of Kamal Bawa, who's an Indian conservationist. With these large models, you tend to view the world through relatively coarse filters. In other words, you don't look at the details of how the social-ecological conservation works and how they can be brought together, the unique differences in culture, differences in politics, the historic context. But rather, you get these models and you try to impose them, and it doesn't work. So the approach we're using, and the examples I'm going to give you are just the opposite. And that is how to develop fine-grained models which are adapted to the local conditions, ecological, historic, political, cultural, etc. And to do that, there's a very interesting paper, or in fact a whole special issue of PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, organized by Eleanor Ostrom and colleagues, that talk about the use of diagnostic approaches, the way, let's say, a doctor diagnoses your medical ailment, one as opposed to another. So rather than saying, okay, everybody who has temperature must have a tropical disease, or some such large course conclusion like that, you try to refine the diagnosis, and you try to refine the kinds of solutions you have to bring to the situation. So I'm going to use 3 illustrations, one from India, some of the work that we've been doing there earlier, and then I'm going to come and talk about two Canadian examples of protected areas with indigenous people to see how we're trying to make some of these fine-grained models. In fact, we're not really doing models, but fine-grained approaches. The Indian example is from the Western Ghats. This is southwest India, mostly around Kerala state and neighboring states of India. It's a biodiversity hotspot, so those of you who follow this literature, if you Google biodiverse hotspots, you get, what, 38? Has it increased to 42? Something like that. It's an area where you have a concentration of high species density, but also genetic and ecosystem diversity as well. And some of the interesting work that's going on here and published in the pages of Ecology and Society. It's a really important journal for some of this material to be appearing. You'll see that this is not the only reference that comes up in Ecology and Society. Is that researchers have been looking at biodiversity in government-designated forest reserves, but also biodiversity in sacred areas, sacred groves, which are basically traditional, socially enforced things, no government recognition, and also in the agroforestry systems. Now, the agroforestry systems here are rather unusual because they're not monocultures. These are not the rubber plantations, the banana plantations that you see in textbooks, but these are rather diverse systems that combine tree crop products with annual crop products. I'll show you some pictures. And in this particular area, it's very interesting. In the Western Ghats, the pictures are from central Kerala, which is the original Malabar coast, which sent black pepper to Europe, back in 1500s. So these systems have changed over the years, but actually, interestingly, they have been sustainable for about 500 years, which is a remarkable record. You'd be hard-pressed to find very many ecosystems that have been productive over that kind of span of time. People talk about, the Portuguese claim that the cork forests have been sustainable over 500 years, but I'm not sure about that. So here we are. Is there a pointer or a stick? There's a stick. Okay. So this is the biodiverse hotspot. If you Google it, you get the picture, you get details. And when you Google it, it only talks about how inadequate the protected area coverage is. There's no mention of sacred groves. There's no mention of agroforestry. It just talks about government protected areas. But you'll see that's not quite the picture. So Kerala covers an area like this, most of this. And the pictures I'm going to show you are coming from about here, about 30 kilometers inland from the city of Cochin, and Ernakulam is the area I'm talking about. So if you travel that 30 kilometers, you go up. These are not high mountains, about 2,000 meters, 2,200 meters. You go up the mountains and you look towards the sea, and it's a beautiful forest. I think we have too much light to appreciate the forest, but this is a lookout, as I say, about 30 kilometers out, a couple of hours from the city, and it's a very nice forest. Now, what I'm going to do is that the subsequent photos are going to sort of start from that top and then go in more detail and more detail to see what we actually have at the bottom of all that beautiful forest. So you go down a little bit and you look and you see a sort of a multiple canopy forest. If you start looking at the canopy, you find, in fact, right on the forest floor, some commercial species, kinds of things that you might find in your Indian curry next time you cook up a curry. And if you look, if you go down the valley a little bit more and start looking at the systems, you find that that whole beautiful forest from that vista is actually a mix of a mosaic of a lot of small, mixed. Very good, thank you. But not maybe too much because people might fall asleep. Just this one, if it's possible to control the other way. Okay, well, whichever you. Okay. Which do you prefer? This? Okay, perfect. Yeah. Anyway, now I'm not a botanist, and I forgot to bring my list. But basically, what you see is banana. That climbing vine is a black pepper, and these are two kinds of herbs, spices. I think you got a mango tree. The picture, the obvious ones are about 8-10 species. If you look in more detail, you're going to find, in fact, 50 to 100 species. And you see this, you look at different places, you see different mixes, but they're all mixes. And they're all species that live together and have lived for many, many centuries. But they are, of course, adding some non-indigenous species into the mix as well. If you're a conservation purist, that's not so good. They're growing vanilla. Well, vanilla comes from Mexico. So does it fit in Kerala? Well, it doesn't, but they found ways to mix it. So I'm not going to make judgments on that. Coffee, the one with the flowers. So it's quite a mix. And it's rather interesting. So the paper in Conservation and Ecology and Society, rather, by Indian at Cambridge University colleagues compared biodiversity in these three areas: the government protected areas, sacred groves, and this kind of mixed agroforest systems. And they found that, in fact, all three had rather high levels of biodiversity, and the human-managed ones, the unofficial ones, had surprisingly high values of biodiversity. For example, they found that endemic tree species were more abundant in the forest reserve, but the threatened tree species were more abundant in the sacred groves. So it wasn't all the same composition. It was somewhat different composition, but all three were pretty good. In more detail, their results look like this. So let's say A is trees. So in the coffee plantations, you had 24 species. Forest reserve, you had 19. And sacred groves, you had 20. And there was another 96 in common, and so on. Meaning there were 20 species in the sacred grove that wasn't found in the forest reserve or in the plantations. But altogether, they made up quite a bit. And B is birds. C is microfungi. The bird one is interesting because, of course, the birds move. So, yes?
And for clarification, which is the agroforest system? Is that the coffee?
Agroforest agroforest is the coffee plantations. Okay. Yeah. I was talking with a student of biodiversity conservation, a graduate student from India, and she was really furious with this. She said, "Well, but birds move. That proves nothing." Well, I guess it doesn't prove very much, but it shows that in fact they found, well, really more birds in sacred groves and uniquely in sacred groves and coffee plantations than they actually found in the forest reserve. So birds move, but trees don't. And still you have trees that you are finding in the sacred groves that you're not even finding in the government reserve. So I think, we're not saying do away with the reserves. We're saying that there is biodiversity in areas occupied and protected by people as well. And that's what the authors conclude. They say, if you're going to do a biodiversity conservation for the Western Ghats biodiverse hotspot, you better take into account not just the government protected areas, but also these other kinds of protected areas, which I think is a reasonable conclusion. I'm turning to two Canadian examples. These are from the Canadian subarctic, not as far or as Arctic as Abisko, but somewhat colder and farther than Stockholm. The first one I'm going to talk about is a developing World Heritage Site. And this involves an indigenous people called Anishinaabe. They call themselves Anishinaabe, but when they talk to outsiders, they call themselves Ojibwa. So they're sort of two terms. We work with one particular First Nation called Pikangikum. The area as a whole has 4 of these First Nations. They're all related. One of the reasons we work with Pikangikum is that they are working to obtain what they call an SFL, a Sustainable Forestry License. In other words, a permit to do logging on their land. Now, this is interesting. On the one hand, we got this conservation area. On the other hand, they want government permission to do logging, commercial logging. Is it compatible? Well, that's what we're working on. White Feather Forest is the name they give to the forestry site. But the larger area is actually a World Heritage Site, but it's in the works, and it's probably not very close yet. So the area we're talking about is here. Pikangikum is here. I'll show you the other map where you find that the other First Nations. In Canada, indigenous communities are referred to as First Nations. Now, I won't have a map later on, but the second example I'm going to give you, this is the province of Ontario in Canada, and this is the province of Quebec in Canada, and sometimes considered a sort of a separate area. And I'm going to talk about the Wemindji First Nation. These are Cree, related to Ojibwa, but somewhat distinct. And this area, I'm going to show you pictures from are right on the coast here. The protected area goes like that, and the marine protected area goes like that. And it includes the most southerly population of polar bears in the world. So it's if you like, a sort of a canary in the mine kind of example. That one is very new protected area proposal, but I'm guessing that it's going to be finished before the Ontario one and many of the big Canadian ones, which are all bogged down in controversy. So that's our setting. In more detail, the white feather forest is within that purple area, and these are the other communities. The area includes an Ontario Provincial Park and 2 Manitoba Wilderness Parks. The funny shape of this is that these are canoeing wilderness parks. So if you come and visit me in Winnipeg and you get yourself a canoe, you can canoe these 2 rivers. So the people of Pikangikum have done a lot of background work. They have produced a land use strategy for permission before they can get the forest license. It's called keeping the land, which is the Ojibwa notion of how to manage ecosystems. Example of some of the mapping in it is that they've actually looked at indigenous harvesting areas, moose, caribou, various kinds of fish, waterfowl, and they've done their land use classifications. I won't go into that, but the point is a huge amount of work has already gone into identifying what areas are important, what forests are important. Turns out that the riparian forests, in other words, the forests that line rivers and lakes, are the most important areas. And then the areas in between can be designated for forestry. But you'll see in a moment, not the kind of regular forestry we normally do in Canada. Now, the Ojibwa concept of keeping the land is very interesting because some of it actually conflicts with ecological conservation thinking or biological conservation thinking. For example, and here's another paper in Ecology and Society, that wonderful journal edited by wonderful people. Pikangikum elders have a great deal of difficulty with the idea of a protected area for caribou, for woodland caribou. Now, woodland caribou in Ontario is on the vulnerable list. Basically, there has been so much forest cutting that their habitat has been shrunk, and there isn't much habitat or much of the woodland caribou left. The woodland caribou is a large, not a subspecies, but a variety of caribou, which of course is a subspecies of your reindeer. So if you think of a rather large and dark-colored reindeer, that's a woodland caribou with rather different behavior. They don't like to have people around too much. And they hate forestry companies. Pikangikum elders say you cannot have an area for protection of the caribou as an area separate from area designated for development, forestry development. They think of much, much larger areas in which these caribou move. So when you do aerial surveys and locate the caribou in 1 year, that's fine. 5 years, that's fine. But an elder that looks at 30-year cycles over her lifetime says the caribou move much, much bigger areas than any of these areas that you people are planning. So elders are thinking, I guess, like some of the protected area people who look at much larger units of areas, larger patterns of distribution in space and time. In fact, Thomas Almquist, who's not here, has done some work in that area. Some of you know those papers. So the elders' thinking fits with that, and not with these rather smaller areas on maps. Elders say you can't tell the caribou where to go. You can't tell the caribou what to eat. And they're going to move, and they don't care what area you have designated for forest cutting or for your park boundary. So you have to allow the caribou to make those kinds of choices. Ojibwa concepts on forest ecosystem renewal are quite different. Now, by standing here, I'm preventing many of you. Should I move back and forth sometimes, or do you see enough of the... Now, these are 2 elders. One of them is Whitehead Moose. He was famous also as the oldest taxi driver in the Ontario North. He was 95 when he died, and he was a taxi driver. But an elder who also made pronouncements on things like, how how forest cycles go. So these two quotes actually capture some of those that thinking. When a forest gets too old, it can no longer produce animals. The animals get tired of eating the same old food. The creator knows animals can't continue eating this old food. So the creator brings fire. And the fire is brought to the land by the thunderbird. Now, thunderbird is a mythical creature. So one of the first master students we sent there came back with maps of thunderbird nests. And I was sure that she was being put on, But, I mean, Ojibwa are very tricky. So, but we went, and yeah, there are areas that they actually do identify as thunderbird nests. You would think a mythical bird would have a mythical nest. But in fact, not so. It's very difficult to figure these out. I mean, the nests are real, but the creature, well, I guess the creature is real too if you're Ojibwa. Another elder, Matthew Strang, observes that the fire brought by the thunderbird creates a landscape which is very different from what the forest company leaves behind. He says, if you go to a cleared land with a plantation, meaning seedlings, typically in northern Ontario, you clear cut in fairly large areas, and you clear cut, and then you plant. A lot of university students find jobs in the summer for tree planting. So you get tree nurseries. The situation in Sweden, I think you do much of the same, yes? So the seedlings are about this big. You have a belt. You have seedlings, and you punch holes, and you put seedlings, and you go. Now, what Matthew Strang observes is that in those plantations, vegetation recovery is very slow. You don't see rabbits, and you don't see birds. He's giving the example of birds because he figures that's easier to communicate. But when I went into the field, whether the rabbits are coming back, snowshoe hares, is actually more important to them than the birds. So, we've done a great deal of work looking at how the Ojibwa system works. I'm not going to do this in detail because then I will run out of all time. But just to point out that, as you might guess, it's circular. This is the Ojibwa stewardship philosophy. Okay, the structure of it is circular, and of course it has four winds, four directions, and within it, it includes a number of things that you would associate with stewardship, but a few other things like strong leadership and so on. And we can't say we have it under control, but some of this developed very slowly through many processes with graduate students and elders. And I think we have a good handle on that. So out of that emerges the idea that there is a stewardship strategy, but it's very different. For example, scientists have certain reasons to conserve species, but the reasons Ojibwa have are somewhat different. They are expressed in metaphorical language, such as the firebird, thunderbird, but also quite often, this is an elder, Ella Dawn Green, says the Creator put everything on the earth for a reason, even if we don't know that reason. So we can't decide which bush should go, which species should go, and which should stay. So the Ojibwa idea is that Creator has given this landscape to the Ojibwa, and it's their job to maintain that landscape with all the species in it. So there is a strong belief that the full set of plant species should be maintained, but they don't name all the species that say some of these tropical groups do, with hundreds of species names and thousands of species names. So we go to the field to really understand how the Ojibwa system works. And that often involves flights in small airplanes, like that. And this is an Ojibwa hunting camp. At this time of the year, this was not this September, but last September. There's some moose drying in this tent. And there's fish cutting here. And people are living in some of the other tents. We had two of our graduate students there, and these are, you recognize, yes? This is Nathan Deutsch and Katie Burlando. They are graduates of the master's program here. Now we've thrown them into the bush. They're doing their PhDs. They're in their year 3, I think. Year 3, 3.5. That's Katie here with an Ojibwa elder. They're cutting fish. This new growth is about 8 years old. It's a jack pine. It needs fire. This area was burnt, and shortly after the burning, you had a great profusion of species. This is the best time to catch snare rabbits. It's a very productive activity. When the trees are this high, the rabbits become less abundant, but other animals move in. So there is a very good understanding of ecological succession in terms of the kind of species they produce. The second example I'm going to give you, better do it fast because we want some time for discussion, right? Do we end at 12 normally? Exactly, yes? Okay. This is a bit of a tongue twister of a name. It translates from the Cree as the Olfactory River and the Poplar River Biodiversity Reserve. This is the one that's going to go very fast because there's no opposition. It's proposed by the Cree. It's not a heritage site. It doesn't combine different pieces. In the other area, the Ojibwa had been kicked out of parts of those provincial parks, so they're very nervous about government people. There's no trust. Here there is. They control the land. They got their university colleagues, us. And it's a large area. That's not a typo, 4,000 something square kilometers. It's not hectares, it's square kilometers, a big area. Now, the interesting thing here is that this area has multiple objectives. It's not just to protect biodiversity. That's, of course, important. But for the Cree, political and cultural reasons are very important. This is the single largest watershed undeveloped, that is undeveloped by hydroelectric development. Everything else has been dammed. And the Cree are sure that at some point, Hydro-Quebec is going to come and dam this river. They are a step ahead of Hydro-Quebec. They want to set this up as a protected area and prevent anybody from coming and developing. So that's a very interesting idea, but that doesn't mean it's not a good biodiversity reserve. It means it has multiple objectives. They want their children to be able to hunt and fish. It's a cultural objective, along with a political objective. And so it's multiple objectives. We debated this in Abisko this past week. Can we accommodate multiple objectives? Well, you know, here's one that doesn't try to accommodate that. So I'll take you on a little trip again. We're flying over a Cree community on James Bay. And we're landing at the mouth of the Olfactory River. This is one of the protected areas, just where the salt water from James Bay meets the fresh water. These are little float planes, Cessnas. This is not a village site, but it's a meeting site. It's a meeting site used by the community once a year. There's all the good stuff happening. Smoked fish. These are mostly Cisco's, small whitefish, Corrigonus, like the ones you would get in the Gulf of Bothnia, different species, but similar. So that tent, that's a smoking tent here. There are cabins, there are canoes, there are lots of people. This is the meeting time. And the reason for the meeting is that we're planning the biodiversity reserve. We have a big tent, mix of university people, the Cree from Weminji, elders, young people. We're doing community consultations. We're doing the planning. We're finding out what people will want to see in the conservation. We are going on field trips. There's an elder. There's Dorothy Stewart, who is one of the organizers, Cree organizers. It's a multi-university team. It's based at McGill, includes Manitoba, University of British Columbia, Concordia. So there's a lot of disciplines here, a lot of geographers, quite a few anthropologists. There's even an environmental philosopher, Dr. Brown. It's a very interesting landscape, and it contains a lot. I would show you more slides, but we would surely run out of time. But this is the one that has that most southerly polar bear population on James Bay. So, what are we finding from these projects? Basically, it's an uphill battle trying to do social ecological conservation, community-based conservation. So the people pre-free parks is still in the mindset. We are getting some acceptance of what we're trying to do here, but it's not easy with the government people and with international people. It's difficult to do multifunctional landscapes. It's difficult to accept cultural landscapes. Our mindset isn't very suitable. In France, they do cultural landscapes on basically agricultural area. Paysage humanisé is a sort of a humanized landscape. It's agricultural. But if it's not an agricultural group, people have difficulty seeing that it's actually still a cultural landscape. The director of Abisko, Terry Callaghan, commented that he's been there for 30 years, but only in the last few years he realized that the scrub forest, which is a birch forest in that area, is actually shaped by reindeer grazing. You take out the reindeer, you get a different landscape. You increase the stocking density of the reindeer, you can graze it right down to a tundra. So in fact, now we're looking at, this is the Arctic Conservation workshop, right? We're looking at ways of manipulating the landscape to, for example, to retain the tundra, like by increasing reindeer density. So some of this is really brand new areas for conservation people who have traditionally seen as, hands-off is the way to go for conservation. Yeah, well, when you got climate change, that's really challenging, that concept. Okay, and of course, many of these wonderful things that my colleagues here at Stockholm do, multi-level governance, Folke and others have been cited a great deal with multi-level governance approaches, and these are the things that are really coming in. Of course, what we're really doing is we want to design some fine-grained applications. Possible solutions. There is flexibility under IUCN Category 5. That's a fairly new category of World Conservation Union. And some of our colleagues have been looking at these. Also, IUCN has recently been talking about indigenous and community conserved areas, ICCAs. This is a sort of a new concept, but it actually incorporates some of this. In Abisko, we were talking about, well, maybe you need a Category 7, which would be protected areas designed specifically to accommodate for shifting species ranges and shifting ecosystem compositions. Protected areas which are meant to deal with ecological change, which would probably give heart attacks to a lot of the conventional ecologists. And the group did include some conventional ecologists, and or conservation ecologists. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. Increasing recognition of indigenous knowledge. Carl and I were just reflecting on the last, well, I guess past, not 3 decades, but 2 decades. Huh? Like when we did that paper in 1993 in Ambio, that really was the first journal paper on traditional knowledge. And, people thought we were crazy. Well, now they don't. Maybe the rest of the world has become crazy. So these protected areas are increasingly requiring multi-level management, adaptive governance, participatory approaches, learning approaches are becoming very, very important in the whole mix. I apologize for reusing, Carl smiles, because Steve Carpenter, Carl, and colleagues actually used this in another article in Ecology and Society, but This is such a wonderful image, again from Dali, in capturing change. You see this not just flying bird, but also flying apples and flying knives and tipping glasses and so on. And that's where we are at. We want to reconnect social and ecological systems where they have been broken, and many protected areas have broken those linkages. We want to go beyond conventional conservation models. And we have to go fine-tune. We have to fine-tune. We have to increase the diversity of experiments, try different things. We have to work with local people. We have to learn about local stewardship ethics. They're not necessarily the same as scientific ethics. With indigenous people, in fact, they're not. But they're different from one another as well. So we want to get away from islands of conservation. And that, I think, is going to be the way to go in a complex world. So a few acknowledgements. Maybe we can have the lights. Still have a few minutes for questions and discussion, I guess.